Great. Well, I'm thrilled to introduce our final panel of today's UK IGF. As we've mentioned before, this panel will be discussing the topical issue of avoiding internet fragmentation. At the national and international policy level, there have been many efforts, or some at least, to fragment the technical and policy architecture of the one internet model. In many forums, the IGF and this IGF included, the necessity of building on an understanding of and developing proper responses to internet fragmentation has become a priority. It's important to recognize that internet fragmentation is multifaceted, it carries different meanings in different groups and in different contexts. And I think that underlines the need for discussion today. So this panel will discuss existing attempts to fragment the internet and, more importantly, the steps that can be taken by the multi-stakeholder internet governance community in the UK and elsewhere to advocate for an open, interoperable, global and free internet. So I'm pleased to announce that in hybrid fashion, this panel will be chaired virtually by Margot James, Executive Chair of WMG at the University of Warwick and former Minister of State for the DCMS with responsibility for digital, telecoms and the creative industries. Joining virtually with her is Akos Erze, an associate from the Government Advisory at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and Scott Malcolmson, expert and author of The Splintnet, How Geopolitics and Commerce are Fragmenting the World Wide Web. In the room, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Marjorie Busher, Executive Director at the Digital Society Initiative at Chatham House, and Emily Taylor, Associate Fellow from the International Security Programme, also at Chatham House, and CEO of Oxford Information Labs. Thank you. Margot, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And my thanks to Fleischmann Hill for arranging this excellent event and, of course, Nominate. Before I invite each of our panelists to say a few words about the subject, I'd like to thank them all for joining. It's a very strong expert panel that we have assembled here this afternoon. And it's a very important subject. As I remember well from my time in government, every effort was made to avoid the fragmentation of the internet, but there were a lot of push-pull factors, some of which, with the benefit of hindsight, I suppose the government in which I served could have done a better job at really focusing on one internet. But there are, of course, many, many challenges to that, some of which I'm sure will come up in the discussion. But I have been inspired by the UN Digital Global Compact. Itself has arisen out of the roadmap for cooperation that the UN published last year. And that is really looking at what are the main threats to the internet from the perspective of ever increasing fragmentation. The emphasis on greater digital cooperation between countries and other organizations, a discussion of the role of internet governance, human rights online, and the goal of achieving a safe and inclusive internet for all by 2030. And there are, of course, a lot of threats to that, and the compact does discuss various ways of mitigating those threats. And once, I believe it's due to be coming into a state of finality in September of next year. So there will be plenty of opportunity between now and then for organisations and individuals to make their views known to the UN. So to discuss these issues, I wonder if any of our panel members would like to kick us off. If anyone would like to volunteer, please step forward. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Scott whether you would like to kick us off with your thoughts. I believe you've just authored a book, Splinternet, which I don't mind plugging. It's a great title, great name, and I'm sure that there's a lot of follow-up reading for us in your book, but if you'd just like to give us a sort of intro to your thoughts on the matter and the challenges to hand, that would be a great start, I think.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'd be very happy to. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can people in
Yeah.
the room hear Scott? I'm getting a kind of mixed
So
response.
that was a
Could you hear me? Were you
yes.
able to hear me? Yes. Okay.
Is that any better? I can get. Is that any better? Yes. Okay.
Looks good.
Great. Thank you. I was in our preparation session. We were told that we have 2 minutes to introduce ourselves and to advance several crucial ideas. So this is going to go quickly. Myself, so I was in journalism for a long time. I was also in government and worked at some international nonprofits. Um, uh, uh, Currently, I advise governments and private clients about geopolitics and technology. As you said, I did write a book. It was actually in 2016, and so it's really outdated. Like any book on technology, it was outdated within weeks of publication. But if anyone wants me to do a second edition, I'd be happy to. Um, uh, Doing a panel on the forces against SplinterNet is a bit of a departure for me, but I think it's a very healthy one. And I'll do my best. But I would just point out that in 2016, I did write about US-China internet rivalry as beginning in the mid-90s. And today it's very hard to see which of those powers is pushing more towards fragmentation of the internet. So I have to get that one reference to the SplinterNet and its increasing fragmentation out of my system. Trends against internet fragmentation. I've identified 7 that I just want to quickly propose, and then I'd love to hear from other people. I should stress that none of these are in themselves good or bad. As you'll find out, they just might tend towards the desired result of less fragmentation. Firstly, the major tech powers, they like the access they currently have to each other's networks. It is valuable for espionage. It's valuable for the pre-placement of cyber weapons, and it's valuable for spreading propaganda outside their physical boundaries. Among these tech powers, we should very much include the Five Eyes, since this is the UK Internet Governance Forum. Second point, the borderless internet has made many aspects of globalization, from high-speed currency trading to globalized subcontracting, possible, and in turn made it possible to bring hundreds of millions out of poverty and create new industrial powers. That is not something that many players will be willing to give up in the name of a fragmented internet. A borderless internet has also enabled elderly societies, I should come up with a different word than elderly, aging societies, to combat stagnation by protecting returns to financial capital invested abroad and to intellectual capital. And they are likewise not going to give that up easily. A third trend that could act towards a non-fragmented internet. With advances in taxation of e-commerce, admittedly a pro-border trend, states are becoming more amenable to an otherwise borderless internet. Fourth point, similarly, the gradual acceptance by tech multinationals of data localization is a pro-border concession that could make an otherwise borderless internet more likely to last. Fifth point, the desire of smaller countries, or better put, smaller tech economies, to have an economic future should militate in favor of a relatively borderless internet. If small economy tech companies could develop only for domestic markets, then innovation and their future growth might tend to be reduced because of potential revenue might be reduced. This would also have tax implications for sure. Sixth point, by the same token, most tech multinationals also want to reach as many markets as they can. And they are also the builders and maintainers of most internet infrastructure. So they have a strong motivation towards having a non-fragmented internet. Seventh, and finally, there is what I think of as the geek infrastructure, which has come up repeatedly in this event. That is the stakeholder community of ISPs, ICANN, and so on, plus the open source community, public-private standards groups like 3GPP, and academic researchers. The indeterminacy of this global community is a good defense against state capture, and its distinctive global culture should act as a barrier to internet fragmentation. So that's what I'm able to come up with, seven ideas why it won't be fragmenting, and I hope there's substance to at least some of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. There's plenty of food for thought in what you have said, and you've got us off to a very positive note. Thank you so much. Marjorie, can I come to you next? And if you'd like to share a little bit about your own background and your sort of starter thoughts on the subject to hand.
Okay, could you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You smiling good in the room. Hopefully you can as well. So I lead a team in Chatham House that looks generally at technology governance and how we can sort of have an effective technology governance overall, and also cooperate on that domain. And on the question of the splinternet, I want to reflect a little bit on how this debate has evolved, and maybe challenge some of the conception and maybe negative conception we could have about the splinternet. And as Scott said, I mean, his book is now, at least 5 years old, and it's in the UK. Then Wendy Hall also had a book called The Four Internet that looks at essentially 4 blocks: Russia, China, Europe, and the US, and sort of depicted the different form of the internet could take and will take. And so in 2019, my colleague Joyce Ackerman and myself reflected on some of the key geopolitical risk that we could see, and what the splinternet may mean at a global level. And I think one of the key worry that we had was to say, well, if liberal democracies like the UK could not agree on a normative framework for a free, open, secure internet, then other countries may be drawn to different models, essentially more repressive models, and that we really need to create this appeal to a very strong internet framework based on democratic rules. And that was, as I say, quite a few years ago. And now fast forward, and that was pre-COVID, that was pre-Chinese new IP. What's the situation today? And I would argue that, well, the splintered digital space exists today, and this is the reality we live in. And potentially the second bad news is that I do not think we have the normative framework that we aspire to. We still are trying to define what are the rules of the game when it comes to open, safe, and secure internet. And democracies are still arguing on key principles such as privacy, such as freedom of expression online, and the regulations are still quite different. And the truth is, a lot of the critical infrastructure that you have in the internet really rely on commercial, at least in Western countries, and in commercial quasi-monopolies, and also the monetization of personal data. So I think it will be unfair to say that we have it right and that we have an appealing model that we can essentially try to export or have other countries adopting. But I suppose the good news is the fear that we have about this repressive model spreading across and sort of going beyond China, which really has been championing it, has not happened as quickly or directly as we thought it could. China's the new IP was obviously not sort of repelled, etc. But I think that what we've seen is actually hybrid regimes, and sort of what we would call swing state and state that could go one way or the others have actually opted for hybrid models. And so they borrow some regulation from the European Union. GDPR has many sister regulation in many parts of the world. They also use US platforms. They equally use Chinese providers. And this is really sort of heterogeneous multiplicity where they combine ideas and sort of providers with they national and regional specificities. And so this is great heterogeneity, but in a way it also has been a fertile ground for some sort of innovation and trying to identify new ways of building the internet. I'm not saying that fragmentation or splinter internet is good and what we should aim for, but I would say that we should probably be humble about what is the model we want to push forwards, and also be interested and curious about what's happening in other places and outside the bloc that we often define by the Europe, US, China, and to some extent Russia. That's it, Marco. That's my introduction.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Marjorie, for sharing those thoughts with us. Excellent. I'm now going to come to Akos. We would be very grateful if you could introduce yourself, Akos, and your background, and give us your thoughts on this topic.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, first of all. The second thing that I quickly wanted to highlight is that I think there's been a bit of a miscommunication. I am actually no longer working at the Tony Blair Institute, but the good news is that I did in the past. And when I did, I actually had the pleasure of working on two reports that are particularly relevant for this discussion. The first one, which I encourage everyone to read, is the Open Internet on the Brink, which was published back in September 2021, if I'm not mistaken. That report highlighted the significance of maintaining a global, open, permissionless and resilient internet, the threat that fragmentation poses to it, and offered a couple of recommendations on how governments can go about trying to secure the open internet's future. And the second report, which was the Leader's Guide to Building a Tech-Forward Foreign Policy, which was published earlier this year in March, really was a deep dive into the challenges that governments are facing when they are having to formulate policies on complex topics like this, like the fragmentation of the internet, and then the challenges in actually articulating and implementing the policies at an international level. And we've taken a look at the main mechanisms that few governments have been using to help themselves from this perspective, which the three things that we've taken a look at are dedicated tech diplomats, dedicated teams in foreign ministries, and then having a dedicated tech foreign policy strategy. And I guess to quickly offer a bit of an observation, 2 quick points to kick us off from my side. First is I wholeheartedly agree with Marjorie that I think it might be a bit too optimistic to try and talk about avoiding the fragmentation of the internet, and maybe we have to start considering how to manage a fragmented internet. And the second point that I wanted to raise is that when it comes to the mechanisms that I've highlighted, so the tech ambassadors, dedicated teams, and dedicated strategies, in terms of these three factors, the UK is actually doing quite well. So it appointed a dedicated tech envoy to San Francisco, and as it was recently announced, it's going to be expanding the scope and sort of the network of the envoy. There is a dedicated team, if I'm not mistaken, of the FCDO, and while it does not currently have a dedicated strategy, it does include foreign policy considerations in the national cyber strategy and the upcoming international technology strategy, which is jointly drafted by the FCDO and DCMS, is a very, very good step forward. And these things and these measures are quite important because it helps the UK with building 3 core capabilities that I feel is very important to counter the fragmentation of the internet. One is anticipatory situational awareness, staying ahead of technological change and its impact on international and domestic dynamics. The second is being able to domestically draft coordinated policy positions with the inclusion of multiple different stakeholders, be it government, civil society, or the private sector, and then putting forward a unified and consistent and cohesive foot forward in the international realm. And thirdly, it helps the UK build a clear strategic vision, so driving its policy in line with priorities, values, and interests that it articulates. And doing so is quite important, I feel, because as it was highlighted before, authoritarian or more restrictive approaches to internet governance and management are gaining ground, maybe not as quickly as we expected in the past, but there is a trend that needs to be countered. So the UK has to know when can it cooperate, when it has to compete, and what are the areas where it must confront at an international level this trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Akos. That was very, very interesting, especially the updated information you gave us about what the FCDO and DCMS are doing in terms of supporting an open internet around the world. Thank you. Now, Emily Taylor, would you like to complete the process by introducing yourself and give us your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Margot. And
sorry to interrupt you already, Emily. If I could just remind the participants, both in the room and online, please do raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or put something in the chat, because after Emily has finished, we will throw it open to wider discussion. So Emily, back to you.
Thank you very much, Margot. Great to be here at the UK IGF. It's been many years. I was originally a lawyer by background and spent 10 years at the .uk registry, and have spent a lot of my career really in those multi-stakeholder internet governance communities that many of us have spoken about. So one of the things that we were asked to think about are what the forces for fragmentation are, and like Scott, I just need to get it out of my system before moving on to more positive type of things. But I think that, the first thing to say is that the internet is this very, very complex ecosystem. So any network will be pulling apart as well as pushing together. You talked about, Scott, the huge incentives that people still have to maintain a single global internet. And I think that is a really, really strong point that will probably stumble us through in some shape or form, even if the reality that we face isn't that pretty at the moment. But there are numerous forces for fragmentation. It isn't just one thing. Marjorie talked about the four internets model. That I don't think that everybody on the planet wants the same thing from this network or wants it to be the same thing. And so there is that sort of very strong ideological and geopolitical difference. This is taking shape and form in laws. And I think that we haven't really majored very much on the force of regulation as a fragmenting force, whether it's keeping data onshore, adding friction to international data flows, or just presenting a really complicated hodgepodge of non-interoperable laws for businesses and people to try and govern, often with extraterritorial effects just for extra fun. But there's also, of course, sanctions and trade wars. I think we haven't really talked about that. Scott, you mentioned how it's hard to tell whether it's China or the US that are driving towards fragmentation more urgently. And I think that particularly the sanctions that we're seeing at the level of semiconductors are very likely to have a perverse consequence in driving China to be fully self-reliant in the manufacture and design of chips. And that will create a fragmentation at a very fundamental and irreversible level, I would suggest. Lastly, standards. You mentioned new IP, Marjorie, and that was certainly the moment, and it's great to see so many plenipot delegation members in the room. That was the moment where a lot of people sat up, because let's face it, standards and internet governance are not the sexiest tech topics. Reading the blurb here, it said, Prime Minister Liz Truss, as one of her major priorities, has ... And I thought that didn't really age very well. And then on Twitter today, I see that another former Prime Minister from 2022, Boris Johnson, is due to keynote in Singapore at the International Symposium on Blockchain Advancements. So there is a life after politics, but it is a perverse
or it's a puzzling aspect of this world that more people think that they can keynote about blockchain than really understand naming and addressing, because it is that the naming and addressing that actually is holding this fragmentary internet together. And so when you have standards proposals that go to replacing naming and addressing with a blockchain core, maybe that will be in former Prime Minister Johnson's remarks, then we have an interoperability problem. And whether that's China proposing it or whether that's our own people proposing it through Web3, the consequences will be the same. And so what can we do, and what is the role of the UK? I think that, you know, several of us have hinted that the multi-stakeholder internet governance in implementation is somewhat less beautiful than it was in concept. And actually, our own house is not particularly in order. We don't have a wonderful example of functioning multi-stakeholder governance to point to, whether that's in standards, whether that's in the naming and addressing ICANN communities. Great to see you here, Kieran, and I think your paper for the Tony Blair Institute really nailed it on these multi-stakeholder processes that were created in the 90s and have stayed there. And so, you know, one of the things I think that the UK can do is to help people rediscover that idealism for the free open internet, however flawed it is in implementation, to really encourage those multi-stakeholder groups to reform, to understand that in a global multipolar world, we will come to these fora with ideological differences, and we need to recognize that, be real about it, and find ways to get through without being blocked. Already we're finding blockages on things that we really shouldn't be blocked on in internet governance. And lastly, I think that the UK has a really interesting role outside of any major trading bloc, in navigating non-interoperable laws, which will have a very profound effect on our economy and our ability to maintain frictionless data flows. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. It was really thought-provoking, your comments, much appreciated. Now, as I can't see everybody in the room from my vantage point, I'm just going to ask Isabella to assist in terms of bringing forward questions from the floor. At the moment, we don't have any questions online. I've got a few, but I will defer to the audience. In the first instance, Isabella, if you'd like to call on anyone with their hand up.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone, for a really interesting first half of the panel. Making sure I'm speaking into the microphone. Do we have any questions in the room or first reactions? Please go ahead. And if you could state your name and affiliation, just because our virtual panelists can't see you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Andrew Campling. I'm a consultant in the tech sector. Thank you for those sort of interesting comments. Given that the internet was originally designed as a network of networks and not a homogeneous network, is the unified network actually a myth, or at best a passing phenomena, not counting the unified namespace, which Emily just talked about? And perhaps more importantly, do you agree that the options now are really that the splinternet is inevitable, and the only choices we have, we either embrace, say, 3 splinternets based around the normative standards in Europe, the US, and China, respectively, as option A, or option B, 3 or more splinternets based around the commercial interests of Apple, Google, and insert your favorite Chinese conglomerate as a third one. So is it just the case of picking the least worst of those 2?
Thank you, Andrew. That's a really good question to kick us off. Scott, would you like to give us your thoughts on that? Those questions, I should say, from Andrew?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Although I really want to hear Margot James's question, so I hope we'll leave some time for that.
Yeah, don't worry, I will make sure.
Excellent, excellent. So I would say a couple of things. Is a splinter net inevitable? Well, leaving out naming and addressing is a pretty big thing to leave out, and I do think that infrastructure is likely to last. Although I was glad that Emily pointed out the threat that comes from blockchain and also from Web3. I think that practically, now this can cut in two directions, but I think that practically speaking, for an awful lot of people, the internet is not so much the internet as it is applications on the internet, which is a relatively small number of things. So the reason that cuts both ways is because the pro or the anti-splinternet way that cuts is that the companies that develop those apps want them to extend over as large a market as possible, which is a point I was trying to make earlier. The way in which it does not operate against a splinternet, I would say, is twofold. First of all, that basically the experience of the internet becomes a fragmented one, even if technically the internet itself isn't fragmented. And then secondly, if the bulk of your internet experience comes through, let's say, half a dozen apps, then the companies that run those apps are vulnerable to manipulation and influence by governments. And so that creates a fragmenting dynamic, I guess. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, so maybe
No, thank you.
No,
thanks very much, Scott. I could invite. Would anyone, any other panelists want to contribute here? Yeah, please, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, you're right. You know, the internet. I think it's the genius of those, you know, lightweight, interoperable protocols that their job was to connect up systems that weren't compatible with each other, and not to try and imagine every possible application that would come in the future. And that sort of brilliant thinking has withstood the test of time really, really well. So yes, it's never been a homogeneous unit, and I hope it never will be. The trouble with the sort of fatalistic approach of, you know, should we just get on? You know, it's like a family argument, like, should we just get on and never speak to each other again? Is like, who's going to miss out there? And I think the global south and the people who are not connected are really going to miss out. And I think that where an area where the West has been really weak is in thinking about how to address those people in the global south, their needs. And China really has been thinking about this very strategically and energetically for a number of years. And so I would say a bright spot also was the ITU elections, which I intended to mention. And I think that probably we are now sitting at a moment where we've got Secretary General of the ITU, who's American, who's really respected as a career diplomat in the development sector. And maybe that sort of experience and a deputy who's from the European Union, UK on council for the first time for many, many years. So, you know, that could be a moment of opportunity, which should be a moment of opportunity, because I'm not sure when those stars are going to align again.
Thank you very much, Emily. Would either Akos or Marjorie care to comment? Don't feel you've got to comment on every question, because we want to get through as many questions as possible. And we've got another one online here. Shall I move on? Okay, before I come back to you in the hall, I just wanted to share a question that's come up online from George Chiesa, a freelance journalist who discusses the issue of personal data and is challenging us to consider when free data flow, it means what it means to some people, but to other people, it means, you know, data privacy concerns. And George is wondering, given the exposure of Cambridge Analytica and all the journalism that followed that, particularly from Carol Cadwallader, do the panel think that public opinion certainly in Britain anyway, favours more the free flow aspect of data or the user control and the data privacy going forward, or indeed, if I can just add a comment there, is that a bit of a false choice? Akos, shall I come to you? Would you like
Sure.
to comment on that?
I'm not sure if I'm best positioned to answer this question. I'm not, I haven't been in the UK ecosystem.
Don't feel you have to. And in fact, Marjorie did talk about personal data in her talk. So maybe I'll come to Marjorie first, and then if you want to say something, Akos, I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Margot. Yeah, and in fact, we do look at government access to data, which is indeed a quite strong point of contention in the international debate when it comes to so governing technology. But just to the point to public perception, and I think it's fair to say when it comes to regulating technology or the internet, we started in around 2010. Saying that basically digital technology and the internet were sort of liberation technology. It allows people in the context of the Arab Spring to speak against their government, to really sort of, gather. And it was a free digital public square that will sort of enable democratization across the world. And then, fast forward a few years, Cambridge Analytica, but also to some extent here in the UK, Brexit vote and other issues, surfaced the issues relating to digital discourse and how they could be potentially manipulated. So we really sort of have a quite strong sort of change of perception that really much affected our, I would say, the public vision of what the internet has to offer and what it can do. And so that's a first point, and I think we still very much, at least in the UK, in Europe, and other places, quite in the techlash situation, where there's a fear about where personal data goes and how it is used. And at the moment, I think the question of government access to personal data is a particularly difficult one, because the notion of privacy is quite different if you look at the US and UK and Europe. Potentially UK is closer to the US, and the Cloud Act, I think, is highlighted as definitely a great success from the UK government as a way to help data flowing between the UK and the US. But I think it's still a very difficult conversation because, as I say, the principle surrounding data access are not, let's say, common to all democracies at this point.
Well, thank you very much, Marjorie. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on the whole free flow of data versus data privacy argument and what's happened in the past?
I could just.
Yes, please do, Emily.
Scott, did you want to go first? Or...
Well. So actually, it's sort of related. What I really wanted to comment on was Emily's earlier remark, which about the global South. So looked at one way, you could say, isn't it a shame that the global South was not brought into a kind of pre-existing regulatory environment created with Western values, I suppose, dominated by the United States, and if that had happened in, let's say, 2003, then things would have really developed much better for a non-fragmented internet. But at the same time, if you look at what the U.S. is doing quite recently, and particularly, as Emily mentioned, the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security regulations earlier this month, or I'm sorry, early in October, you just simply can't, and I say this as an American, I mean, you simply can't anticipate that the US will always want to have a non-fragmented internet. It really wanted one when it entirely controlled it, but it's sort of steadily wanted it less and less as it's lost control. Not too surprising, really. But the point I wanted to make is just that I think that the debates over the internet, including the split internet, have tended to get into the box that Marjorie mentioned of EU versus Russia versus China versus US. I liked that at the end of her remarks, she added to some extent Russia, and the to some extent I think is very important because I would say right now, India is a much more important player in global internet discussions than Russia is. Brazil under Lula and under Dilma Rousseff played a large role in global debates, a very interesting and productive role in global debates over internet governance. Under Bolsonaro, it more or less disappeared. Now that Lula's back in office, perhaps it will reappear. So, time passes and the world changes, and countries can become major or minor players. And of course, Britain has been both over the years, and hoping that Boris Johnson stays in Southeast Asia, Britain could be an important player again at some point. So I just wanted to make those points, but I'm sorry, they don't strictly answer Mr. Chies's question.
No, thanks very much, Scott. Emily, did you want to come back? No? Okay. Well, let's move on. Isabella, are there any more questions from the floor? No? Okay.
Sorry. I was just getting up from my seat. Yeah, we have one from the grey blazer in the corner. If you could state your name and affiliation, that would be wonderful as
Definitely.
well.
Yes, hi. Can everyone hear me all right? Fantastic.
Yeah.
So my name is Michaela. So I work at Global Partners Digital. So we're a civil society organization based in London. And I wanted to pick up on what a few of the panelists have mentioned already on multi-stakeholder engagement and the importance of maintaining that. And it was really positive to hear, especially from Scott, that that's been seen as a force of countering in fragmentation, because that's something that actually my company is working on. And so as part of that, one of my questions is first, how do you see multi-stakeholders kind of being what are the most efficient methods for multi-stakeholder organizations such as civil society to be involved in a field that's so nation state and corporate dominated? And so that's something that I've been kind of thinking about, and it's something that my organization has been grappling with. And I also similarly wanted to pick up on a question about kind of who to target and these conversations. So thinking about, I think it was Marjorie who mentioned these kind of hybrid model states that are almost kind of in this middle way, kind of between fully authoritarian and fully democratic, however you want to define that. And at the same time, you have, for example, the Summit for Democracy led by the US that's really just targeting, for the most part, whoever ostensibly presents as democratic, but you have some kind of, I would say, some hybrid model states in that. So would a more targeted effort to prevent fragmentation be, I guess, more efficient to target these hybrid models? Is it to really stick with the ones that all agree on very basic democratic principles? If we don't have that agreement, where do we turn? Should you be targeting the authoritarian regimes? So kind of a geopolitical question, as well as kind of how multi-stakeholders can engage. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't catch your name, so sorry. Could you repeat your name?
Yes, Michaela or Michaela, whatever's easiest.
Michaela. Thank you, Michaela. Right. Thank you for that. Can I come to Akos? Would you like to comment on that? I think you were talking about the Open Internet on the Brink report at the beginning of your opening remarks. And I wondered if there was something in there that might trigger some responses to the question of multi-stakeholder engagement and the tension between civil society organizations that are so important to the open internet and nation state dominance.
Of course. So I think one of the relevant recommendations that the Open Internet on the Brink report makes is there's a number of them, but one of the most relevant ones, I believe, is the creation of an expert-led multi-stakeholder panel on internet policy that would essentially be fulfilling an advisory role to a broader sort of tech alliance established by the D10 countries. But I also wanted to highlight a few other things. I think it's important to think about what sort of internet fragmentation or which aspect of the internet fragmentation you would like to target in your engagement. So are we talking about standards? Are we talking about the let's say, submarine cables, or are we talking about semiconductor supply chains, There's a number of areas that needs engagement, quite frankly, and there are multiple levels that you can engage on. I think, and even though this mechanism is available in a limited number of countries for now, tech ambassadors, particularly those focused on the diplomatic or cybersecurity aspects of technological foreign policy or tech foreign policy, might be a good stakeholder group to start a dialogue with.
Thank you very much, Akos. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on? It's quite an important question. I thought that was for the overall topic of internet fragmentation. Yes, Emily.
Thank you, and thank you, Michaela, for that question. It can be really difficult for civil society voices to be heard in any governance system, and especially the multilateral ones. I'd like to give a shout out actually for the UK government's approach to engaging in multilateral governance fora, which is to bring a multi-stakeholder delegation with them. I think that's a really effective and to your word, efficient way of using those resources within a quite constrained environment, because of course other processes like the open-ended working group, the ad hoc committee that are going on at the moment are really struggling to get meaningful multi-stakeholder participation. And I must say, nothing warms you up to traditional multi-stakeholder internet governance than a spell in those sort of environments. But who to target with that hybrid model? I think that so my colleague at Oxford Information Labs, Carolina Cairo, who's a lead author in our recent paper on standards as being the latest frontier for the free and open internet. So her point on the Global South is that a lot of the Global South, so there might be Global South that are ideologically aligned to authoritarianism and would quite like the sort of authoritarian model, but maybe hadn't got it together in time like China did to build it out in the first place. But a lot of other Global South states, and this is Carolina's point, is that like there's a much more pragmatic approach, and so there's something that we just haven't really been very good at. And I was pleased to hear Sir Jeremy Fleming mention this in his recent speech at RUSI. It's like we've got to get the deal for the Global South as the West, and that's not just a speech about human rights. It's not just advocacy for free and open internet. It's money and infrastructure, and actually having a choice that competes with Huawei and really attractive loan arrangements. So if we don't want the Global South to go in that direction, then we have to have a really compelling alternative that is more than just words.
Thank you, Emily. That was the most interesting response. Yes, when you look at how China have sought to influence African countries through physical infrastructure, to my knowledge, nobody has thought to replicate that, possibly with the exception of the social media platforms, with the virtual infrastructure. And I think that's a very good opportunity. Scott, did you want to come in there?
Yes. So this is an extremely interesting subject. So so China's expansion into Africa in particular, but also into other Global South is the term we're using, markets. It was not done that explicitly in order to as a political move. It was in a couple of cases, but I mean, I've argued this elsewhere. Really, the main motivation was that China wanted its own companies to be able to expand, and those companies were not going to be able to expand into the territory already taken by their Western competitors. Their Western competitors were not in Africa in particular, although also Central Asia, to some extent the Middle East, to some extent Latin America and Southeast Asia. Why weren't they there? Because they didn't think that they could make enough money there. So to Emily's point, I mean, if you're going to get in a private sector dominated internet system, if you're going to get more Western influence in the global South via its companies, that is, if we agree that that's a good thing to do, then you have to do it with those companies. And in the end, you're going to do it at least partly by doing what China did, which is taking enough state money so that when their private companies went into these markets, at the end of the day, those private companies made enough back from the investments that they were making. So that would be my first point. And then just the second point, which I know I'm kind of going on about this, but I really truly think that the best hope for a non or less fragmented internet is, in a sense, to have it more fragmented. I mean, 193 countries is a multi-stakeholder system. Each one of them has a tech economy that they want to grow. So they do not want the global internet to be reduced to the number of people who are available in Singapore or in Vietnam. And so, in a sense, having 193 governmental stakeholders should, at least, or potentially could lead towards, could act against the fragmentation in order to preserve as big a market for their own companies and therefore for their own economies.
Thank you, Scott. Would anyone else like to contribute? Yes, Marjorie.
And it's very brief, but I think just to build on what Scott, but also Emily and mentioned, I think, and also Akos, it's a question of, the splinter net exists, but we can definitely try to tackle specific aspect, and which aspect is it? And for me, I think a good question is it is basically, can you have interoperability but with heterogeneity, and sort of if you can keep some way to have similarity but allows for heterogeneity in terms of potential norms or regulation and how people experience it, I think that would be for me a valuable goal, because I don't think you can tackle all aspects, but at least keep a level of interoperability would be, I would think, an important goal.
Thank you. And Akos, your comment.
Sorry, I'm muted. Just very briefly on Scott's point around private companies, I think it's a very important aspect of this. And as we've discussed in preparatory chat for this panel, as Scott, you mentioned, there are two kinds of discussions around internet fragmentation. One that ignores the private sector and one that actually incorporates it. And I think it's very important to have one that actually includes and is conscious of the growing geopolitical significance of tech companies, particularly platforms, as well as tech companies as the owners of critical infrastructure, such as cables. And I don't quite think that we've figured out, and maybe tech diplomacy and tech ambassadors are maybe a right step in this direction, but I don't think we've quite figured out how best to engage with companies, and I don't think companies figured out it either. Having a public policy team is not necessarily sufficient. So there's additional thinking that needs to be done there, and I think there's a need to. There's a point for needing to reconsider or reconceptualize the responsibility of tech giants in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Akos. So talking of tech giants, so I'm just going to come towards the end of the session now, because I think we're due to end at 5:15, and it is 5:15, or even just gone. Before I close this particular session, are there any more questions from the floor? There's none online, but I just want to double check. We have time for maybe one last question. But if not, then
yes, there is one. Sorry, just running from my chair to the podium. There's one final question. If you could, it's okay. I'm not fast enough. If you could say your name and affiliation and your question.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Izan Khan, Youth Ambassador at the Internet Society. Thanks for the conversation. One of the questions that I really wanted to ask was, how worried should we be, instead of avoiding internet fragmentation, having a version of the internet, at least at the application layer, where the most stringent regulatory rule sets sort of win, because we already have precedent being set by Western nations when it comes to worldwide blocking orders. For example, in the Canadian Supreme Court and in the CJEU. And given that a lot of big tech platforms are operating globally, what's to prevent authoritarian nations to sort of go to them and say, well, you need to block this sort of content worldwide? So instead of having a fragmented internet, we have an internet where nobody's allowed to do anything that, unless it's sort of agreed upon by every single nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izam. Who'd like to kick off on that one? Scott, do you want to have something to say on that one?
Well, just that it's something very much worth worrying about, although I guess the silver lining of the US-China conflict is that it will probably prevent that from happening over the next 10 to 15 years. I just wanted to also just say, I know we're out of time, but I've written down Marjorie's slogan, interoperability plus heterogeneity. It's not quite as short as SplinterNet, but I think it is probably more important. And I think that's a really, really good thought to finish on. So thanks for having me on this panel.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much. Any comments on Izam's very pertinent question from any of the other panelists? Yes, Emily.
I don't have a solution for it. I think it is a real issue, and actually what we're seeing, as you alluded to, is that a lot of countries are taking a cue from the EU in terms of extraterritorial effect, and also not allowing data to leave their borders under certain circumstances, seeing that in India, also in China. And so that, what we're going to lead to is sort of layer cake of non-interoperable laws that affect everybody everywhere. And obviously that's not going to be ideal. So I don't know how we're going to cope with it. I think what that tends to happen in other sectors is you get to a point where no one can take it anymore, and that leads to a sort of deregulation or also regulatory arbitrage in some way. We did at Chatham House a simulation on cross-border data flows in a rapid response to ransomware things, where we were trying to get data back onshore to the UK from India, imagining that they had implemented their privacy laws. And really, in the end, it came down to, well, can we possibly get the data from somewhere else? Can we avoid touching India with the, and I'm just taking India as one point in question. Once you have a really stringent regulatory regime, what it will do is actually the opposite effect of what you want. It will drive data offshore and make sure that it doesn't touch, and it will impede commerce and free flow of data. So I think this is a fun for us to come. We haven't solved it, and it's a real issue. So thank you for raising it.
Well, thank you, Emily. I think that on that note, I think it's probably time to close. It's a shame, because I was very much enjoying the discussion, and it's aroused a lot of thoughts in me. On the data flows, the regulations that Emily was just alluding to, they sometimes as well vary within countries, because if you look at the United States, California has introduced data protection legislation, which is very similar to GDPR, really. And there are other states wanting to regulate other aspects of online activity. So that is, in a sense, leading to fragmentation within countries as well as between countries. And it's an endlessly fascinating subject, which I wish we had more time to talk about. But I am mindful that, Isabella, you, as this is the last session of the day, you might like to just close the day itself, as we thank the panelists on this particular part of the proceedings very much for their time and insights. And Isabella, back to you to round off the day. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. If we could all just thank the panelists together, that would be great. Thank you.